Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is six-time Grammy-nominated music scholar Rob Bowman, whose new book is Land of a Thousand Sessions, The Complete Muscle Shoals Story, 1951-1985. If the role of Muscle Shoals, a town in northwest Alabama, in modern music history doesn't immediately pop to mind, allow me to mention a few of the landmark tracks recorded there. When a Man Loves a Woman by Percy, Sledge, Land of a Thousand Dances by Wilson Pickett, You Better Move On by Arthur Alexander, I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You by Aretha Franklin, I'll Take You There by the Staple Singers, I'd Rather Go Blind by Etta James, If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right by Luther Ingram. And then came the 1970s. In pursuit of the earthy funk sound captured in those studios, the rock and pop world invaded, and the Rolling Stones, Rod Stewart, Joe Cocker, Jimmy Cliff, Paul Simon, and Bob Seger cut major hits there with members of the famed house band sitting in. Then country came calling, Willie Nelson, Hank Williams Jr., Mac Davis, Jerry Reed, and so on. To say Rob captures it all doesn't quite get it. Clocking in at 762 pages, including essential indices, and with its fluid narrative style, Land of a Thousand Sessions at times feels like a minute-by-minute history. Fortified with a generous supply of photography and printed on beautiful stock, the book is as appealing as it is essential. As a fan of the music made in Muscle Shoals, and as a music journalist, I loved it. In addition to his Grammy-nominated liner notes that are worthy of independent publication, Rob is also the author of Soulsville, USA, The Story of Stax Records, and The Last Soul Company, The Malaco Records Story. Rob Bowman, welcome to Writers at Work. Rob, I was continually impressed by the book's consistency. I entered the world you were depicting, and I didn't leave until hundreds of pages later. And I'd like to discuss how you made that happen. Let me start with let me start with this.
How did I make it happen? With a ton of research, obviously. And I'm very passionate about this music, as I hope you can tell with the writing. And so I'm a university professor. And so I'm pretty busy for 12 weeks in a row, teaching classes, preparing them, and so on. Then I'd write intensely over the Christmas break. I'd write all summer. And I was doing research while I was writing. Some people, and I've done this before, have done years of research and finally sit down and write the whole thing over 6 months. This was written in different periods, but the final push, if you will, started June 2024, when I realized to get it out for this November, which was when the Country Music Hall of Fame was mounting a massive Muscle Shoals exhibit, so it made sense to get it out, cross-promote them, and so on. I realized last June I would need to hand in a final manuscript by January. So I probably wrote over half, maybe even 2/3 of the book between June and January, writing 6 to 10 hours a day, literally every day. Get up, just sit down. And occasionally in the middle of that writing, I would be doing more research. I'd realize, wow, I can't quite put this together. And I'd try to set up a phone interview with somebody or dig deep in some other ways. But most of that was just consistent writing. The first half of the book was written over several different periods. I started research in 2019, and here we are in 2025.
Yeah, I think one question I'd ask is, what is this book? That is to say, I'd call it an invaluable documentation of mid-20th century American music. I'd call it an engaging read peppered with anecdotes about great American musicians, some of whom are hardly known to the public. I'd call it a handsome coffee table book, lovingly served. I mean, what is this book?
Well, for me, and not to sound arrogant, I hope, but it's a definitive history of Muscle Shoals as a studio scene from 1951 to 1985, where an incredible number of great R&B soul records were made, an astonishing number of pop and rock records that were massive hits were made, And then it became a maven for top 10 country singles from 1980 to about 87. 10 studios were involved. The two main ones obviously are Fame and Muscle Shoals Sound, but I cover the output of all 10 studios. This is a story that I felt needed to be told. I believe in going to the wall and back with when I do my work. Sometimes people feel it's too long, but for me, it needs to meet what the story is worth. And I wanted to tell a story with the richness and dignity that the musicians, the songwriters, the engineers, the producers all deserved. So we also have over 200 photos in this book, maybe even 300. I've never counted them. So in some ways it does have, and it's on high quality paper. And of course it weighs a lot because of that.
Yeah.
750 pages. So in some ways I see your coffee table book reference because of its size. But we mostly think of coffee table books as being rich in imagery, which this is. We also think of them as being relatively light in terms of the number of words and how much detail we get. This
Yeah.
book is not light that way. You get an incredible amount of detail. This story is told, I think, with as much depth as anyone will ever be able to tell it. My goal with this is to have it in libraries across the country and have it as a reference for as long as human beings live, for people who want to know about Muscle Shoals. And my other goal, of course, is for music fans such as yourself to read it front to back and go onto Spotify or YouTube and play things they never even heard about by obscure artists like Pep Brown, or learn a whole lot more about how Aretha Franklin came to be the great soul singer she came to be,
Mm.
cutting I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You in Muscle Shoals. So it is multi-purposes, and I think it's several kinds of books in one.
You know, when you take on a project of this magnitude, you have to have a certain sizable readership to make it happen commercially. And that can dictate the writing style. When you take on a project like this, do you make any assumptions about who your reader will be?
Yes and no. I know my reader are going to be music aficionados. I doubt that too many casual people will buy this book. It's not, oh, there's a great drama in here, and you might not care about music, but you should read this. There's lots of drama in here, but it's drama about music. So I assume that from the beginning, that's who's going to read the book. And I don't adjust for any audience in particular. I write what I think the subject material deserves. So my Stax book, for example, which won 2 of 3 American Music Book Awards when it came out and was recently adapted for a 4-hour HBO series, which has been running, I guess, for about a year and change, and just won a Peabody Award, and the Books in the Blues Hall of Fame. That book was 3 times the length what the publisher initially wanted. We argued about it, but I was not budging. I take the stand that if this is what the story needs, this is what I'm going to write. And if I lose a few readers, I'm sorry about that, but this is what it needs. But I know by the feedback I get that those who read it love it and truly, truly appreciate it. And so do the musicians, that somebody cared enough to tell a story with this much depth.
Rob, there are a couple examples where you straddled the line perfectly between a very knowledgeable music fan and somebody with a maybe just a cursory interest in music. I'll use the example of Arthur Alexander. Um, well, why don't you talk about Arthur Alexander a little bit?
Arthur Alexander was a bellhop at a local hotel in Muscle Shoals who started hanging out at the city drugstore, actually the studio above the city drugstore. Muscle Shoals has all sorts of nooks and crannies and weirdness in its story. And quickly, the city drugstore studio, Spar Music, was started by the one bohemian, the one beat kind of guy that was in Muscle Shoals in the late 50s, Tom Stafford. It became a hangout place. It wasn't really a recording studio, although demo recordings were made up there, but it's where nearly everyone who was important in the first 8 to 10 years in Muscle Shoals music hung out. Arthur Alexander was the only black person who hung out there. Muscle Shoals is 90% white, 10% black. Arthur found out about it, went up those stairs, introduced himself with his group, said, I can sing, I can write, they're open, they want to hear this. Eventually, he becomes separated from the group. They think he's the guy with really real potential. And he cuts a great record up there, Sally Sue Brown. But it doesn't do anything, although Bob Dylan later covers it. When Rick Hall leaves the city drugstore scene, partially because he's kicked out, he starts Fame Records and the first Fame recording studio, which was an abandoned candy and tobacco warehouse. It was like a rat's nest. It was hardly a professional studio. But Rick got Arthur Alexander over there and cut an extraordinary record that literally defined the whole idea of country soul music. The record's called You Better Move On. Rolling Stones fans might recognize it because they covered it in 1964. You Better Move On was the first substantial national hit to come out of Muscle Shoals. By Arthur Alexander, local bellhop, Rick Hall producing, it starts the whole game really rolling.
And what's interesting, I think, and I probably would have said, yeah, I know that, but I know it a lot better now, is how true to the Alexander and Hall version of You Better Move On was the Stones version.
Oh, it's virtually identical. I mean,
Yeah.
they are
And
literally copying it as close as they can.
and I you described the sound that Arthur Alexander and Rick Hall were getting, and um, to me that is phase one of the Fame sound. Would you agree to that?
100%. 100%. And one of my goals, in terms of what kind of book is this, which you asked earlier, is it's a lot of things. It's a history. There's individual biographies within it. But with each studio, and there were 10 studios in Muscle Shoals, two super important, three maybe other studios that are very important, and then five, much less so. But with each studio, as much as I can, I describe what the studios sound like, the dimensions, the kind of equipment, the miking, and how sounds come about. And it's not a technical manual. It's not something you need to have gone to engineering school to understand. But in those moments, I try to make that stuff very palatable for your average reader, but to understand that these things help create that magical, washy cymbal sound, for example, on
Yeah.
Arthur Alexander's You Better Move On. And I think, what I do in teaching and what I do in writing, besides imparting information, we all understand the term critical reading or critical thinking. I try to engage my listener in critical listening. So they'll
Hmm.
hear things in ways they haven't heard them before, and that will enrich their experience. It'll make these records that are already great, even if they know them, that much greater for them because they'll experience them in a much different way.
Well, I'm going to take myself out of my notes for a minute here because you just touched on something that I was really knocked out by. Um, Probably the greatest individual song performance coming out of Muscle Shoals would be When a Man Loves a Woman. Can we agree to that?
We'll agree to that. Is the first million seller to come out of there, Atlantic Records' first million seller, and it's an extraordinary song. The only place I might wiggle a bit is I Never Loved a Man by Aretha Franklin. Is a
Yeah, yeah,
close
yeah,
second. If I
yeah.
had to take one of those, I'd cheat and
Okay.
get somebody else to take one with me.
And so yeah, the point I'm making is that, now I would say that you and I are about the same age. I've probably heard that song 1,000 times.
Me too.
So now
Absolutely.
I listen to it after reading what you wrote about it, and I cannot believe what Roger Hawkins plays on the drums in that track.
Oh my God, he's phenomenal.
He's fantastic in that track. And they come out of the middle point and he drops a bomb that is so perfectly placed. Um,
And
you
the
know, he,
fact that you've heard it 1,000 times, and I'm getting from what you're saying, perhaps you hadn't really noticed just how incredible Roger Hawkins' playing is on that, is exactly what I'm trying to do for all readers. So I'm so glad that worked for you.
yeah, no, I mean, the band is so subtly applied that you as the listener, or we as the listener, or I as the listener, enjoy the entirety of it without focusing on one thing or another. If I'm going to focus on something, it's going to be on Percy's vocal.
Of course.
But the entirety of the piece, now you are encouraging me to take it apart. And, I'm sure I could, I could have done this on, I mean, how many tracks, with Barry Beckett's playing on keys. or with David Hood's playing on bass, we could say that's the most important part of that song, and probably be wrong. But to make us listen with big ears is a wonderful gift a writer can give to the reader and
Well,
listener.
thank you. And I'm a musician myself, and that's why I've been a musical professor or professor of music for 45 years. So that's always that ability to hear and think as a player has always affected the kinds of interviews I'm able to do with other musicians because they can relate to that and I can get in deep in the weeds, if you will, and then try to make that deep in the weeds stuff much more accessible to a lay audience. And it also allows me to both in teaching and writing to convey that kind of nuance that makes things so much richer when you begin to hear them and understand them to, again, non-musicians and lay readers. It's something that I've done, for decades now. And I think it's really important. And a lot of writers who aren't musicians can tell great stories, but they can't get into the music quite in the same way. So I think that is something I can bring to a project like this that I think is valuable.
Yeah. And there's another thing I love about the book is you don't belabor things that I think other writers might have belabored, but the Rolling Stones cut uh, Arthur Alexander's "You Better Move On," and then they come to Muscle Shoals to record parts uh, of
Sticky fingers.
and yeah and Brown and
They do
you
Brown
know
Sugar, Wild Horses, and
oh,
you got to move.
yeah and so here they're going full circle now with this, and they're seeking the sound that they sought in their earliest days. Um, the house musicians at Fame and who then moved on to Muscle Shoals were white, and they largely supported vocalists who were black. You touch on this issue, but it doesn't seem to have been such a big deal in the South, at least that immediate region. Was it?
No, it was not a huge deal in that region as it would have been perhaps in Montgomery or Selma or Birmingham. Muscle Shoals, Northwest Alabama, and given the turmoil and the ugliness in the civil rights period of white supremacists in much of Alabama, that did not read in the same way or play out in the same way in Muscle Shoals. And I'll tell you why. It's not like everybody there was just the best people on earth, but population was 90% white, 10% black. That meant that those invested in segregation, for example, or who were white supremacists, had little to fear in terms of substantive uprising by the black populace. So they had no need to be as oppressive as some whites felt they needed to be in other more mixed places.
Hmm.
That same time, the black population, only 10%, wasn't big enough to mount a substantive, if you will, civil rights
Resistance.
protest. But at the
Yeah.
same time, they weren't, there was segregation. There's no denying that. But it was much lighter and less oppressive. So, there wasn't the tension between the two races in the same way there were further down south. Now, there's an interesting thing. Muscle Shoals is part of a quad city area. Florence is the biggest of those four cities. Florence integrated their public library years and years before the rest of the state did. That's the kind of place Muscle Shoals was, where small things like that, but also important things, could be smoothed over locally. Now, at the same time, when they integrated the public library, they had to keep the restrooms segregated. Well, they kept them closed, actually, and the drinking fountains closed because Alabama state law wouldn't allow them to integrate those two facilities. So, where it was possible, the Muscle Shoals area worked around Alabama state laws because nobody felt the same tension or the same threats. That doesn't mean there weren't prejudiced people. Obviously, there were, but not in the studio scene. And it was not an issue for black musicians to be driving up to, quote, a studio owned by a white person with white rhythm section and walk in and out, coming and going. It wasn't a big deal. In Memphis at Stax, police would go by Stax and see a black musician or a white musician hanging outside, and they'd get out of the car and throw them against the wall. But what's going on here? that sort of thing wasn't happening in Muscle Shoals. It was a quiet, sleepy kind of place without a ton of tension compared to most places in the South. And that
Uh,
allowed this to happen. And I should say the rhythm section was white, as you correctly observe, initially. By 69, the famed rhythm section was very integrated, but the horn sections from the beginning, or nearly from the beginning, were integrated. So you would have black horn sections or black and white horn sections and a white rhythm section. And at Fame, one of the two most important studios after April 69, you also had an integrated rhythm section.
you touched on this um, in a light-handed, definitely way, which I really appreciated. But um, apparently, it was more of a big deal when some redheaded hippie guitar player pitched a tent out in the Fame Studios parking lot.
Well, you're talking about Dwayne Allman, of course.
Right.
And Dwayne, the Muscle Shoals guys look so straight. And they were relatively straight. Not much was going on in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, except for great music making. It was a dry county. There's no bars you could drink in. This is a pretty straight place. They all had short haircuts. Dwayne freaked them out. Except his playing was so damn good, so
Yeah.
inventive, so creative, so innovative that, of course, he's accepted pretty well immediately. But yes, Dwayne having hair down to his chest and dressing in ripped jeans and, who knows what kind of t-shirt on a given day definitely caused ripples amongst normal citizens in Muscle Shoals. He was
You
a
know,
freak in a way they hadn't seen freaks.
I think David Hood said that they when they played, they had pocket protectors in their shirts because they had pens in their pockets, and they looked like accountants.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's amazing when you see the photos and you hear this incredible music that came out of it. You got to think, Dwayne had been out on the West Coast. He'd lived in Los Angeles for a couple of years with Greg with the band Hourglass. He had seen the West Coast. He had experienced the drug culture, and Dwayne was one of those bohemian kinds who didn't care a whit about somehow fitting into mainstream culture. Nobody in Muscle Shoals was like that. They did look like accountants or bank tellers, and they happened to love black music and played really, really well. And were chameleons. They could adapt to any artist, which is why they could cut hits with Aretha Franklin and Bob Seger, and record with Leon Russell, Joe Cocker, Traffic, and the staple singers and Bobby Womack. These guys could just adapt, let alone they made perhaps Willie Nelson's greatest album, Faces and Stages of Muscle Shoals Sound. It's extraordinary the adaptability of these short-haired, accountant-looking kind of musicians.
I think it was early last year. I stopped by the Fame Studios. I was driving through Alabama, and I took a little detour. And it's an amazing whenever you do that, and there's nothing magical outside. There's no rainbow over the roof of the building. There's no, Twinkie dust sprinkled out of the sky. That what happens inside when the lights are, when the red light goes on.
Fame from the outside couldn't be more ordinary. A lot of people wouldn't even realize it's a recording studio.
Right.
But when you go in, and maybe it's because of the music that was created there, you do feel a magical vibe. It's like going into Stax or the original Chess Studio or Abbey Road in England or the Motown Studio or Hollywood's Capitol Record Studio. There is a feeling when you go in there, even before you start playing music, that this is a special, sacred kind of room.
So I understand you interviewed about 100 people for the book.
About that, yes.
Did any revelation catch you way off guard?
Oh, that's interesting. Um,
Let me add a parenthetical to that question, because
sure.
did any revelation catch you off guard to the point where you had to alter your narrative?
Not alter the narrative specifically, but I got incredible detail that let me sort out, especially the early stuff, in a way that no one's ever been able to. And
Mm.
I was able to correct a lot of mistakes. A lot of writers tend to they do their best to figure something out, but when they don't have all the information because they haven't been able to interview people, or they're not taking the time to do so, or they haven't dug for paperwork, such as the land registration papers for when Rick Hall bought Fame, they approximate something as best they can. Other writers copy that, and the same mistakes get repeated over and over and over. Uh, I have tons of footnotes in my book that sometimes are explaining why my account is different than the account you'll find in 8 other books, which have copied each other. And that's because I dug further and got details of how things actually unfolded. Whether there's something that completely turned my head around, uh, well, there's things I didn't know, and I don't think anybody knew. How did Wishbone start? Well, um, the eventual owners of Wishbone, Terry Woodford and Clayton Ivey, they had both worked at Muscle Shoals Sound. Terry Woodward was part of the publishing company there. Well, something nobody's ever written about, and I found out through several sources, was there was a hostile takeover attempted on that
Oh,
publishing company, which got the rhythm section, needed to say, up in arms, and it would have worked if George Soule, Terry Woodford's partner, who I interviewed before he died, hadn't felt guilty about it and decided, no, we're not going to do this. So there had been, sort of high-level meetings at a local hotel that were quite ugly, where it looked like their publishing company was being taken away from them. That eventually came out right. I mean, is that a huge revelation? It's fascinating, and it does change the story because that publishing company becomes very, very important. So things like that, nobody knew. It's just a level of history at a deeper level.
yes, yes.
Muscle Shoals Sound also recorded, surprisingly enough, several really hot disco hits that were big hits in clubs and in the disco scene. A lot of them coming through a Montreal production company. Nobody had written about that as far as I know, or they'd written one sentence. Again, I interviewed the owner of the production company, the Muscle Shoals guys, some of the artists, and although I'm not a massive disco person, it's a small part of the book. It's still part of the story that is
Mm.
told now with a level of richness that nobody had before.
Rob, let's talk a bit about your background. You were born and raised in Toronto. What was the music scene like in the city when you were growing up?
Toronto was an odd city in that before massive immigration, which started around 67, Toronto was a pretty white city. It's now the most multicultural city in the world, according to the UN. More than New York, more than Paris, more than London, which might surprise a few people. It's extraordinary, and it's great. But when I was growing up, pretty well a white city, but oddly enough, a white city with an incredible black music scene. Black artists were constantly playing several clubs on the Yonge Street area week after week after week. They'd be booked in for 6 days with a matinee on Saturday. So I was seeing when I was 12, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, T-Bone Walker, B.B. King. All of those people I was seeing at this one club. Now, the drinking age was 21, but this club had an upstairs, which was a restaurant license with a huge cutout. So I could book a table at the rail upstairs, see directly down to the stage, and go there at the age of 12 and see these incredible artists. My first interviews when I was 15 were at that club. T-Bone Walker was my first one. John Lee Hooker was my second one before he had his rebirth and became, famous again. There's lots
Yeah.
of soul acts playing here at Le Coq d'Or. Funkadelic lived here for a while in that period. Let alone we had bands comprised of white people like Robbie Robertson and the band, who
Yeah.
they backed up Leland Hawkins. They were called the Hawks back then, before they became the band. But they were an extraordinary R&B band. They cut 4 blues tracks in '63. This is before Eric Clapton's doing it in England, that are among the greatest white blues tracks you'll ever hear. They're the first group, as far as I know, to cut at that level. Before Butterfield, before um, Clapton with the Yardbirds. We had an amazing black music scene here. And there's bands that you wouldn't know of, like Mandela, who didn't make it internationally, but again, were stone R&B bands. It was an amazing music scene. And because Toronto's the gateway to Canada, um, touring acts would play here that might not be playing, what we'll call them secondary cities. So somebody's going to play just New York and LA, they're going to play Toronto too. If they play 3 places in North America, we're getting it. If they play 2, it's often just New York and Toronto, um,
Really?
which, it's amazing. We now have 10 million people. It's a huge city, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it wasn't. It was more like maybe approaching 3 million in the Greater Toronto area when I was growing up. But it's always had an inordinately great music scene.
So this exposure to Black American artists um, stimulate an interest in the American South? Because it's clear for me that your interest goes beyond the music.
Oh, 100%. I did my PhD in Memphis, and I deliberately did it there because I wanted to live in the South. I wanted to live within the culture that had produced so much of the music that I cared about. And I really understand cultural expression, which, music's just one form of cultural expression, as being a part of a larger whole. So doing my PhD, not only did I do all the music stuff, um, but I also took anthropology courses. I studied various African American forms of religion. Um, and I spent my 3 years in Memphis going to black churches most weeks. Uh, I went to fife and drum picnics in Senatobia, Mississippi. I got as deep into the culture, and not just black Southern culture, white Southern culture too, as I possibly could, because the music meant so much to me. I knew that to really talk about the music, I needed to understand the culture in the widest sense possible. And, even back in grade 8, or long before I'd visited the South, we were given uh, in social studies, a project to do. We had to take 2 books, 2 articles, 2 poems, and write about something. I chose racism and the civil rights movement.
Mm,
And I argued that Curtis Mayfield and the Oppression's Choice of Colors was a poem, song lyric, but I argued it could be included. But I also was reading books by E. Franklin Fraser and W.B. Du Bois. I mean, I was a pretty ahead of my time in terms of the level of what kind of books I was reading. I just was fascinated. All of this started, I'll be straight with you, when I was 7, the Beatles. Beatles
mm.
changed everything for me as they did for most people, or many people, I should say. It's like there was a day before when the world was grayish, and a day after when it was unbelievably bright. There
Yep.
was a reason to every morning get up. There's Beatle records. Well, a year later is Rolling Stones. The Beatles turned me on to Motown, of course, and funnily enough, Arthur Alexander, because they cut Anna, which is another Arthur Alexander song that we hadn't talked about. But Stones turned me on to obviously post-war Chicago blues, and quite quickly, the Stones were also cutting a lot of soul records. And in fact, I bought my first black record when I was 10, Otis Redding's Try a Little Tenderness, because of the Rolling Stones. They'd covered an Otis record called That's How Strong My Love Is. Some listeners might know it was originally cut by Ovie Wright, but Stones didn't know that. They knew Otis's version. And I love that song. I love the way Mick Jagger sang it. And Mick was talking in an interview about Otis Redding. And I thought, oh, okay, I need to go buy an Otis Redding record. Went to my local record store, asked them for That's How Strong My Love Is. They didn't have it, but they had the new single, Try a Little Tenderness.
Ah.
Bought that, took it home, dropped the needle, and suddenly there was this incredible world of other sonic possibilities, other social meanings that I had never encountered. Now, I wasn't one of those people who's like, oh, forget Beatles and Stones, that's inauthentic. No, I still, to this day, love the Beatles and Stones. But this opened another world to other music that I love as much and often more, which was what Otis Redding represented. And quite quickly, you know, Percy Sledge is When a Man Loves a Woman I bought. I bought Aretha records. And I began to realize these things had something in common. I didn't know what Stax was or Muscle Shoals yet, but within a few years, once Rolling Stone magazine appeared, I was buying that from the very beginning. It was really the first serious rock magazine before it became the corporate thing it is today. But it was incredibly informative. Reading it cover to cover. There weren't books out at that point. The first rock books trickled out, and one soul book trickled out in 68, 69, 70. They were very thin on the ground, and but I read every one of those too. So by the time I was 15, I get this job writing for a magazine. I lied about my age, so I was 18. I knew about as much as you could know in that period before the incredible amount of work has been done by all sorts of writers. We have volumes on everything. Back then, there was so little information, but what there was, I had. And by 16, I had my first cover story. And there's an interesting circular thing to this. Stones turned me on to Otis Redding and by extension soul music. Years later, Keith Richards is reading my Stax book, loves it, and I get a phone call wanting to know if I want to spend 3 weeks on the road with them, interviewing them for an autobiography they want to do called According to the Stones. It's going to be about music, not just sex and drugs. And indeed, we did that. Spent 3 weeks on the road in California and Australia with the Stones. And the book comes out with their names as a byline, because the interviews are edited. So you get 2 paragraphs of Jagger talking about something, then a paragraph of Keith talking about something, then maybe 2 paragraphs of Charlie, and it flows that way. But I got that gig because they love my Stax book. Stax book never would have happened if I hadn't loved what they were doing when I was a kid.
No, well, tell me a little bit more about this book, please. The Stones
But,
book.
oh, it's called According to the Stones. It's a coffee table red book. It came out in 2003, maybe 2004. I have credit on the inside in very small 6-point text.
Gotcha. Okay. No, the reason I ask is I know this book. Um, I've been arguing that Keith is the most misunderstood rock star. That he is a far more substantial person than he's ever credited for.
You're 100% correct. My Keith's copy of my book, Soulsville, USA, The Story of Stax Records, had probably 150 to 200 sticky notes on marking pages where he's put notes.
Wow.
He reads virtually only nonfiction. He's a complete expert in World War II, reads everything, but reads a lot of music stuff too. Has an encyclopedic memory. I'd ask Keith about a bass line on a record from '66, or I'd ask him about the record, maybe the session, and Keith would go, well, if you listen to the bass line, there's this Tampa Red record. That'd be from 1942, and I know those Tampa Red records, so I know he's not faking it. And he's going, I took the left hand of the piano, and I changed it like this, and it just worked perfectly. And he's 100% spot on. He's got a mind like a steel trap.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's incredible. Mick Jagger, on the other hand, can't remember details at all. Doesn't really care whether Goat's Head Soup was made in '66 or '92. But he remembers the vibes and the feelings and the color of situations. So he can tell you a lot of interesting things, but it's a very different kind of memory and different kind of mind than Keith.
Yeah. So listen, now you've done Muscle Shoals, you've done Stax, you've done Malaco. Will you continue to explore American soul and roots music?
Yes. I'm looking at 2 possible books right now. One is on a transgendered soul singer from Nashville who actually moved up to Toronto and had hits up here. Was big in Boston, Montreal, Toronto, and to a secondary degree in LA. Her name is Jackie Shane. I did a CD compilation in 2019 that I co-produced and wrote the liner notes for. It was Grammy nominated. We didn't win. Jackie got the cover of the New York Times Arts and Entertainment, and she also got the cover of Washington Post art section, big NPR stuff. Jackie had this huge renaissance when we put that box set out and got the Grammy nomination. Unfortunately, she died 9 days after the Grammy. But I promised Jackie a book, so I'm starting work on that. I've done several interviews for it and doing some archival work. And I don't know if this is going to happen, but another major soul label actually approached me about a week and a half ago, the person who currently owns it, and said, would you be interested in this? We got a pretty good archive, and they can hook me up with the people who are still alive. And I'm thinking of that. That's not even close to being a done deal. But I'm thinking it might be an idea. And if the archive is as rich as they say it is, which means there'll be a lot of material I can work with to tell a story in a fulsome way, that could become the book after Jackie.
My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is 6-time Grammy-nominated music scholar Rob Bowman, whose new book is Land of 1,000 Sessions, The Complete Muscle Shoals Story, 1951-1985. As you can tell, I loved it, and I recommend it to any and all. Rob, thanks so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Jim, thank you so much. This is a pleasure. I'm so glad you enjoyed the book so much. And by the way, there's one Grammy win in amongst those 6 nominations.
There is. Okay.
I took a trophy home one day.
Good for you. Well deserved, I'm sure. Rob,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
You have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye. Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersaTworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.